Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to be brief. I'm trying to get my hands around this, and it appears as though even though we've had a reduction in workforces both federally, statewide, and on municipalities, there still exists an unfunded mandate out there, or an unfunded liability out there, excuse me, with regard to the defined pension plans. And Ms. Prunty, what I'm trying to understand is at some point, as a financial rating organization, you have to look at these pension plans and say it's too good to be true. I mean, you have to look at the investments that they're making in order to fund these, correct?
When we are analyzing pension, we do include pension in our review. It's part of our criteria and has been. We look at all of the underlying assumptions. We look at the liabilities, and it is factored into our rating. You'll see a differential. For instance, Utah is a AAA-rated state, and they have very proactively managed those liabilities and looked at their assumptions. And so you do see us factoring in
but they've looked at it and made adjustments from moving away from defined benefit plans. Is that correct?
That's part of the solution in Utah, but that's not universal across governments. Most of the pension plans do remain defined benefit.
In your statement, you say, in general, we believe worst-case scenarios regarding pensions will likely occur only if governments are unable or unwilling to use their powers of adjustment. What would you recommend to be their powers of adjustment in order to avoid the worst-case scenarios?
Yeah, I don't think we would have a recommendation on what the power of adjustment is, but I think that history has shown that they have the ability to either manage the liability side of the equation or increase contributions or make other adjustments to the overall program and plan. So those are really policy choices that each individual state or local government will make.
Moving from a defined benefit plan to a contribution plan would be a step in the right direction. Would you not agree?
I think that we would say that those are, again, policy decisions that each government is going to make on, and we'll look at the overall impact on the liabilities.
But from your perspective, from your financial rating perspective, it would be more advantageous to a better rating if it was a contribution plan.
I think proactively managing the liability is certainly very positive, and making a strong commitment to funding the pensions has historically been consistent with a high rating level.
Mr. Curd, I want to go to you for just one quick second, because you also are in the financial rating business now. If, as the title of today's hearing implies, bailouts on public and private programs, if there were ever to be a bailout, would that not be an assumption then that a financial rating service would have to take into consideration when giving a rating? I mean, once the precedent is set?
Our ratings don't assume that the Federal Government will bail out states. We do assume that the
let's assume that it is done, and that a bailout is actually done.
What we do consider is that the Federal Government has always, and by law, assumes the cost of emergency response in the event of natural disasters and other man-made events, and we do build that into our ratings. Since the role of the Federal Government in providing bailout, if a state were to need assistance, is uncertain, we don't embed that in our ratings because we don't have enough precedent to reliably know that investors could depend on that.
But it would seem to me, though, that once the precedent is set, then it would have to be considered as a potential assumption in making your ratings.
Considered, I mean, a precedent is situationally based, and may be a result of particular circumstances that may not be something we could rely on in the future.
Dr. Biggs, one thing real quickly. Mr. Curter points out that we do not expect any states to default on their bond obligations in the next 12 to 18 months. Do you agree or disagree with that statement, and why?
I think I wouldn't want to overstate my competence in this area, because it really depends on state-by-state knowledge, and it's also extremely difficult to predict low probability events. If we had defaults every year, we'd have very good models for knowing what leads to a default. At this point, they're so infrequent, it's hard to say. So I think I would agree, but it's certainly not something I'd be complacent about. Okay.
And Senator, last question. Given the bad results of many revenue bond projects, should such highly risky projects benefit from tax exemption?
Pardon me?
On municipal bonds. Should we continue to have tax-exempt municipal bonds, or should Congress come into play and say, hey, wait a second, these things are so risky, they're such a high rate of default, we're incentivizing the sale of them with tax exemption. Should we as Congress step back and say, you know what, maybe we should readdress the tax-exempt status of these things?
I think that's a good question. I think the challenge we have more with our municipality is having them overextend themselves because of the free ability of credit, and we're addressing that in our state ourselves, trying to make sure that our cities aren't overextending themselves, and we end up being the catch-all for them. So that's something to consider.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired, and with that,